The color left Colonel Hargrove's face the instant he saw the patch on my jacket. Not the rank on my shoulder, not the medals on my chest. Just that small, faded piece of fabric pinned near the collar. He went completely still. Around us, the hall buzzed with voices, dress uniforms, the clinking of glasses at the regimental dinner. None of it seemed to reach him. He took one slow step toward me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I thought he was making conversation. Retired colonels sometimes asked about insignia. But his eyes weren't curious. They were unsettled, the kind of unsettled that comes from recognizing something you believed had disappeared a long time ago. "It was my uncle's," I told him. "He passed away 2 months ago." The colonel swallowed once. He glanced around the room briefly, then looked back at me. "We need to speak privately," he said. "Tonight." That was the moment I realized my Uncle Raymond, the man my entire family had dismissed for 30 years, might have been someone none of us ever truly knew. My Uncle Raymond Calloway was the quietest person in every room he entered. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of Moncton, New Brunswick, the kind of neighborhood where the streets flood every spring and nobody locks their doors. No new furniture, no framed photographs, no stories about where he'd been. If you asked him about his past, he'd pour you a cup of tea and say, "Nothing worth repeating, sweetheart." My mother's family never had much patience for that answer. To them, Uncle Raymond was a disappointment wrapped in a flannel shirt. He hadn't built anything. He hadn't accumulated anything. He had no property worth mentioning, no registered savings worth asking about, no career title you could put on a Christmas card. He showed up at family gatherings, sat near the window, drank his tea, and left early. My mother once said he made her uncomfortable not because he was cruel, but because he was impossible to categorize. "He always acted like he knew something the rest of us didn't," she told me once. It was exhausting. My aunt on my father's side was worse. She used to joke that Raymond had wasted every advantage a person could have. I was 12 the first time I heard that. I didn't understand it then. By the time I was 20, I'd absorbed it the way children absorb everything without questioning whether it was true. Raymond had served with the Canadian Armed Forces. I knew that much. It was printed on a document I'd found years earlier in the back of his hall closet while looking for an umbrella. A release certificate with the words, "Special Operations," visible before I read any further. I'd put it back without asking him about it. I'd been 23. It didn't seem like my place. He never talked about it. Not once. Not to me, not to anyone. When he got sick alone. He had been diagnosed with a pulmonary condition the previous winter. He told no one in the family except me, and only because I called him every Sunday and he finally ran out of reasons to change the subject. I asked if he needed help. He said he had everything arranged. I asked if he wanted company. He said I was busy with my own life, and he didn't want to be a burden. I was working in Halifax at the time, trying to hold together a lease and a junior officer position with the Royal Canadian Navy Reserve. I told myself I'd drive to Moncton in a few weeks. I told myself that for 6 weeks. By the time I made that drive, he was in hospital. The facility was small, understaffed the way rural hospitals in New Brunswick often are in February. I found him in a room at the end of a corridor with one narrow window facing a parking lot. He looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. He had an IV in his left arm and a paperback novel open on his chest that he hadn't been reading. He smiled when I walked in. That specific smile, a little wry, a little relieved that I'd seen on his face since I was a child sitting beside him at family dinners while everyone else talked about people he didn't know. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "I know," I told him. "Your mother know you're here?" I said she did. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he understood the full meaning of a short sentence. He was gone 11 days later. Quietly, the way he'd lived. A nurse called me at 6 in the morning. There was no one else to call. I phoned my mother. She said she was sorry to hear it and asked whether he had a will. I phoned my aunt. She said it was a shame and asked whether there were any assets to deal with. My cousin sent a text saying he'd try to make it to the service if his schedule allowed. He didn't make it. There were 4 people at the funeral. Me, the pastor, a woman from his street who said she'd occasionally shoveled his walkway in exchange for him fixing her car, and an elderly man who introduced himself simply as Gerald, said he'd known Raymond years ago, and didn't elaborate further. I stood at the grave in freezing rain, and felt something I couldn't name settle inside my chest. Not grief exactly, though. Grief was there too. Something quieter than grief. A kind of reckoning. Afterward, I drove to his house to begin going through his things. My mother had asked me to deal with whatever needed dealing with. She made it sound like a practical errand. The house was exactly as I expected. Tidy, spare, nothing wasted. His work boots by the door. A row of library books on the kitchen table. A single coffee mug in the drying rack. In the second bedroom, which he'd used as a combination storage room and office, I found 2 banker's boxes of documents, a shelf of military history books, and a small corkboard with nothing pinned to it. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a folded topographic map of northern Quebec, I found the patch. It was small, maybe 5 centimeters across dark green with a design I didn't recognize. Not a standard Canadian Forces badge. Not any regimental insignia I knew. The stitching was worn but intact, and on the back, in faint permanent marker, someone had written a date, February 1991. I didn't know what it meant, but I remembered seeing it before. He used to keep it in a small tin on the shelf when I was a child. I'd picked it up once, maybe age 9, and asked him about it. He took it gently from my hands and said, "That's just something I keep to remind myself of a few things." I put the patch in my jacket pocket and took it with me when I left. 2 weeks later, I attended a regimental dinner in Fredericton. I wore the patch on my jacket without fully thinking about why. It felt like something to do with my hands, in a way a physical presence of something I couldn't resolve. That was where Colonel Hargrove saw it. He was a tall man, late 60s, with the kind of upright posture that persists in retired military people long after the uniform is gone. I'd been introduced to him earlier in the evening as someone who had served with JTF too before a long career in operational planning. We'd exchanged the usual pleasantries. He'd moved on to speak with someone else. An hour later, across the room, his eyes landed on the patch, and the conversation he was in the middle of simply stopped. He excused himself and walked toward me at a pace that was controlled but deliberate. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the jacket. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I explained. "My uncle, Moncton, 2 months ago." The colonel's expression shifted through several things I couldn't fully read. "What was your uncle's name?" he asked quietly. "Raymond Calloway," I said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he said, "I think you should sit down." We found a small anteroom off the main hall. Just 2 chairs and a side table with a water jug nobody had touched. The sounds of the dinner faded to a low murmur through the door. The colonel sat across from me and studied the patch again for a long moment before he spoke. "There are units within the Canadian Special Operations community that don't appear in any public-facing structure," he said. "Not in Department of National Defense directories, not in official histories. They exist for operations that require what's called plausible deniability. Do you understand what that means?" I told him I did. "Your uncle was part of one of those elements," he said. "For nearly a decade." My heart rate changed. I kept my hands still in my lap. "Then why is there no record of him?" I asked. "Because officially," he replied, "he was never there." I thought about the man who used to fix engines in his driveway on Saturday mornings and let me sit on an overturned crate and hand him tools I didn't know the names of. I thought about the man who, when I was 17 and failing chemistry, drove to Halifax from Moncton on a Thursday night just to sit with me at the kitchen table and work through problems until I stopped panicking. I thought about my mother saying, "He always acted like he knew something the rest of us didn't." "What does the patch mean?" I asked. The colonel leaned back slightly. "It's an identifier," he said. "Internal to a specific operational group. It was never meant to leave the unit. Most were turned in. Some were destroyed." He paused. "The fact that he kept it tells you something about what it meant to him." I thought of the tin on the shelf, the date on the back, February 1991. "He told me it was something he kept to remind himself of a few things," I said. The colonel nodded slowly. "That sounds right," he said. "My family treated him like he had failed," I said. "Like he'd spent his life avoiding responsibility." The colonel's expression was careful. "That is very often what happens to people who serve in that way," he said. "There are no parades. There is no record. There is nothing to show a family at Christmas dinner. And without something to show, families draw their own conclusions." He looked at the patch one more time. "Raymond Calloway was not invisible," he said. "He was deliberately unseen. There is a difference." On the drive back from Fredericton, the highway was dark and the radio kept cutting to static through the hills. I drove with both hands on the wheel and tried to reconcile two versions of the same person. The uncle who got quietly written off by everyone in my family, as someone who had never amounted to much. And the man, a retired colonel, had just gone pale over. I called my mother when I got home. I told her I'd met someone who recognized the patch. I told her what he'd said. There was a pause on the other end. "Sweetheart," she said, with the particular tone she uses when she's already decided something, "your uncle was a private person. That doesn't mean he was a secret agent. People like to make things more interesting than they were. More interesting than they were." I asked her if she remembered him asking for help once, years ago, when his truck needed repairs and he was between work contracts. She said she thought she remembered that. I asked what she'd said to him. She was quiet for a moment. "I probably said we were stretched at the time," she said, which we were. She wasn't lying. That part was probably true. But stretched and unable to help is different from not showing up at the hospital. Stretched is different from asking about a will before the body is cold. I didn't say that. I just said goodnight and hung up. I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the patch in front of me and went back through every memory I had of Uncle Raymond. The man who, now that I thought about it, had never once owned a credit card, who paid for everything in cash, who changed his phone number every few years without explaining why, who had never, in 30 years of living alone in New Brunswick, once used a computer with internet access that I'd witnessed, who had, I now realized, made himself extraordinarily difficult to find. I reached out to a retired warrant officer I'd trained alongside in the reserves, someone who had spent 15 years in conventional forces before moving into training roles. I described the patch. I told him where I'd found it. There was a long silence. "I've heard of something like that," he finally said, "but only in the context of a program that was disbanded. I don't know the details." "What kind of program?" I asked. "The kind," he said carefully, "where the people involved were never supposed to have identifying materials in the first place." I asked him what that meant. "It means your uncle bent a rule to keep it," he said. "Which means it mattered enough to him to take that risk." A week later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender identified himself as Colonel David Hargrove. He wrote that he'd made some inquiries after our conversation and there was additional information he believed I should have. He asked if I would be willing to meet again. We met at a coffee shop in Fredericton Neutral, quiet, the kind of place where you can have a conversation without being overheard. He was in civilian clothes. He brought a manila envelope, which he didn't open immediately. "I want to explain something first," he said. "What I'm about to tell you is not classified at the level of national security. Some of it has been internally acknowledged, though not publicly. But I'm telling you as one person to another, not in any official capacity." I said I understood. "Your uncle was part of an element that conducted operations in support of CSIS and allied intelligence partners throughout the late 1980s and into the mid-1990s, he said, primarily in Eastern Europe and Central America. Personnel recovery, disruption of trafficking networks, protection of intelligence sources. The operations were real. The outcomes were real. The unit, on paper, did not exist." He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a single photograph and 2 pages of text, portions blacked out. The photograph showed a group of 8 men in civilian clothing standing in front of what appeared to be a cargo building. One of them was unmistakably my uncle, younger, thinner, with the same watchful stillness in his posture that I'd always known. "He was a primary operator for the better part of 9 years, the colonel said. He was responsible for the extraction of 3 intelligence assets from situations where extraction was considered impossible. At least one of those individuals is alive today because of him. Possibly 2 others." I stared at the photograph. "He never told anyone," I said. "He couldn't," the colonel replied. "That was the condition of service. Not a suggestion, not a strong preference, an absolute condition. You sign on to that type of work understanding that the record of you doing it will never exist." "So he disappeared," I said, "from his own history." "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what he did." I thought about my aunt saying he had wasted every advantage. I thought about my cousin's text saying he'd try to make it if his schedule allowed. "My family never saw any of this," I said. "They thought he was just private, difficult. Like he was hiding from life." "He was hiding life," the colonel said quietly, "for reasons that had nothing to do with failure." I brought everything I'd gathered to my mother's house on a Saturday afternoon in April. The photograph, the pages from the envelope, the email exchange with the colonel. I also brought the letter I'd found folded into the topographic map when I'd finally gone through the second banker's box properly. It wasn't sealed. It was written in my uncle's handwriting on a single page of white paper, the kind he kept in a block by his kitchen phone. It was addressed to no one specifically, which I understood to mean it was addressed to whoever found it. If you're reading this, then I've gone. I hope whoever you are someone who occasionally thought to call on a Sunday. Not because I needed much, but because it helps to be thought of. There are parts of my life I was never able to explain to the people around me, not out of pride and not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because explaining would have meant confirming things that were supposed to stay quiet. The people those things protected are still out there somewhere, living lives they wouldn't have if a few of us hadn't done what we did. That's enough for me. It was always enough. The patch in the desk is the only proof of any of this. If someone important ever comes across it and asks you where it's from, just tell them the truth, that it belonged to me. That's all they'll need to hear. I watched my mother read the letter. She read it twice, the second time more slowly. My father sat across from her. He hadn't said a word since I'd spread the photograph on the kitchen table. I didn't know, my mother said. I know you didn't, I said. He could have said something, even a little something. He couldn't, I said. That was the whole point. She set the letter down on the table and pressed her fingertips against the edge of it. He asked me once, my father said, finally speaking, if I wanted to have lunch. When he was in the city for something, years ago, I said I was too busy. He exhaled slowly. I don't even remember what I was busy with. My cousin had come over when I called him. He sat at the end of the table and hadn't touched his coffee. He asked me to help him move a piece of furniture once, he said. I told him to hire someone. Nobody laughed. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. He didn't die alone because no one cared, I said eventually. He died alone because all of us decided, separately, that someone else was probably taking care of it. And none of us ever checked. My father nodded once. We didn't deserve him, he said. I didn't argue. I just sat with that. My family asked, a few weeks later, whether we could hold a second service. A proper one, with the people who had actually known him, not just the ones connected to him by birth. I contacted the colonel. I contacted Gerald, the man from the funeral, who turned out to have served with Raymond in the early years and had never spoken of it to anyone. I contacted the woman from his street, who brought two of his other neighbors, both of whom had stories about small, specific kindnesses that none of us in the family had known about. There was no military ceremony. Raymond would not have wanted one. We held it at the Veterans Hall in Moncton on a Thursday evening in May. The colonel came in civilian clothes and stood near the back and said nothing publicly, which was the right choice. People told stories. The woman from the street said Raymond had rebuilt her furnace motor one January when the temperature had dropped to -28 and she hadn't been able to afford a repair service. Gerald said he had once seen Raymond talk a young soldier down from a very bad night using nothing but patience and black tea, and not leaving until he was certain the young man was going to be all right. One of the neighbors said Raymond used to leave grocery bags on porches when he knew someone was going through a hard month, and he always did it before sunrise so no one could thank him. My father stood up near the end of the evening. He was not a man who spoke publicly with ease. I spent a long time, he said, measuring people by what they could show me. Their title, their house, whether they seemed like they were winning at something. He paused. Raymond never seemed like he was winning at anything. I thought that meant he wasn't trying. Another pause. It turns out he was doing something the rest of us didn't have the discipline to understand. My mother cried quietly in the chair beside me. My cousin placed the folded Canadian flag from the funeral on the table beside a photograph of Raymond we had found in the banker's box, him around age 40, standing by a lake somewhere in Quebec, squinting into the sun and almost smiling. The colonel came and found me before he left that night. He would have found this excessive, he said. I know, I said. He also would have been glad someone finally paid attention, he said. In the weeks that followed, something changed in my family, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things change when a foundational assumption turns out to have been wrong. My parents started asking questions about him that they had never thought to ask while he was alive. My father drove to Moncton once without telling anyone and went to the Veterans Hall to sit for an hour. My cousins started calling me on Sundays. The colonel wrote to me once more before he retired. He said there was one final thing he wanted me to know, that the individuals Raymond had helped protect had been made aware, through appropriate channels, that the operative responsible for their safety had passed. That the acknowledgement was quiet, not public, but that it existed. That somewhere, in the right rooms, Raymond Calloway's name was known. He ended the letter with a line I've thought about almost every day since. Your uncle believed that the highest form of service was to protect something without ever needing to be known for it. He was right, and he was one of the very few people I've ever met who actually lived by it. I drove to the cemetery on a morning in June, before the heat set in, with the patch in my hand. His new headstone had been placed the previous week. My family had arranged it together. Simple granite, his name, his birth year, the year he died. Below that, at my father's suggestion, 3 words. He was here. No rank, no service branch. Nothing a stranger would question. Just the acknowledgement that he had existed, and that someone knew it. I crouched by the stone and held the patch for a long time. The metal fence at the cemetery boundary creaked slightly in the wind. Somewhere on the other side of town, probably, someone was cutting grass and a dog was barking at nothing in particular. An ordinary morning. I thought about what it cost to be quiet. Not shy quiet or conflict. Averse quiet, but deliberately, purposefully, structurally quiet. To do the thing fully and correctly, and then step back and let the record show nothing. To be reduced, in the eyes of the people who should have known you best, to someone who never quite amounted to anything. And to accept that. To live inside it. To not explain. I pinned the patch back onto my jacket. My family still carries regret, and I think they always will. But they carry something else now, too. A different way of looking at the people in their lives who sit near the window at dinner and leave early, and don't talk much about where they've been. I'm still serving with the reserves. I still believe in structure, in chain of command, in the value of visible service. But I measure things differently now. Rank tells you what someone has been recognized for. It tells you nothing about what they have actually done. My uncle's name will never appear in a publicly accessible document. His operations will never be written about. The people he helped will grow old without ever knowing his name. But I know it. And I wear the patch. And I remember. Because that is the least that I can do, and it is the most that he ever asked for.